Well, hey everybody, it's September 23rd, 2013. My name is Wes Hagen. I'm the vineyard manager and winemaker here at Clopepe Vineyards and Clopepe Estate Wines in the beautiful Santa Rita Hills of Santa Barbara County, California. And we have kind of had a nice, wonderful, and slow start to our 2013 vintage. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. Two things on our short video for Monday. One is my definition of the 2013 vintage as being a winemaker's vintage instead of a vintage of weather and extremes, and I'll be explaining that. And then I also want to talk really quick about the 4 criteria that I have for pulling the trigger as far as bringing fruit in and harvesting. So criteria for harvest will be the second part of this, and the first part, of course, is going to be sort of my defining what I'm seeing in the 2013 vintage, specifically in the Santa Rita Hills of Santa Barbara County. Now, up north, Napa-Sonoma, it's been warmer during the late summer and the early fall. So I know that most of the Pinot Noir and Chardonnay has been harvested up in Sonoma Coast and in areas north of here. It was a slightly shorter vintage up north and a slightly longer vintage, or potentially a much longer vintage down here. Interestingly enough, Santa Maria is pretty much done. And Santa Rita Hills is sort of just barely kind of starting and stops and starts. Now I know some people who've harvested most of their stuff out of the Santa Rita Hills, pulling in Chardonnay at about 22 to 23 bricks, which is a little low for me. I like to see some flavor develop in the 24s. And then in the Pinot Noir, I know that some people are actively picking, including myself. I brought in, something like 7 to 8 tons of Pinot Noir already in my estate stuff, around 23.5 to 24 bricks at about 3.3 pH. Now, as far as a winemaker's vintage, what do I mean by that? A winemaker's vintage is a vintage where the vintage is dictated by winemaker decisions instead of basically nature taking over. Good example of a sort of a harvest vintage that was really dictated by weather. I would probably say either 2004 or 2010. 2004, we had a very short season. Come around Labor Day, we got about 102, 103 degrees, and it stuck there for a few days. So we went from, we got 3 weeks to go till we're harvesting almost overnight. And the 2004 vintage was sort of short and hot, and I wasn't very much of a fan of that vintage. Now, let's talk about a winemaker vintage. I think the best winemaker vintage we've had in the last maybe 10 years was 2009. 2009 was a year without extremes. We didn't have tons and tons of heat. We had a long, mellow, cool growing season. So instead of like basically looking behind you and seeing a big wave of heat coming and sort of panicking and trying to get out there and harvest the fruit as quick as you can before sort of nature takes over and kind of wrecks otherwise great vintage, we've kind of had the opposite effect this year, sort of a little bit more like 2006 or 2009 this year, in which we don't see that big tidal wave of heat coming. So we're sort of relaxing and kind of watching the fruit ripen very, very slowly. And as the fruit ripens very slowly, we can kind of pick the moment that we want to define the vintage. So it's the winemaker defining the vintage. It's the winemaker saying, this is the style of wine we're going to make. And so far, the way that I see 2013, unless something really changes, is you could make a very delicate and elegant wine. You could make sort of a really nice sort of middle-of-the-road, beautiful, balanced wine, or you could make a pretty big, rich, ripe wine, depending on how long you wait. One thing we are seeing is rather high pH shifts, which means we bring the grapes in at about 3.3 pH, and by the time we fire them up with yeast after they've soaked on the skins a few days, we're seeing that the pH is rising, which means the acidity is lowering, and we'll talk a little bit about pH later. But we're seeing a pH shift of about 0.2 pH. So if we bring it in at 3.3, by the time we fire it up with yeast, we're seeing about a 3.5 pH shift. So the wines could be a little softer this year. I mean, we're seeing really good TA. TA doesn't really, TA is titratable acidity or total acidity. And the TAs are very, very solid. So we have good acidity, but we're seeing the pH or the mouthfeel kind of softening a little bit as things progress. So I'm defining 2013 right now, unless we get a big change in everyone's struggles and hustles to pick. I really see 2013 as a long, extended growing season in the Santa Rita Hills, a little bit more than in many, many areas. So theoretically, the vintage variation between different wines and different wineries in the Santa Rita Hills could be pretty high this year. Not to say that the quality will be different. I think people who bring the fruit in early are going to make beautiful and delicious wines. People who bring the wines in late are going to make rich and ripe and voluptuous wines. I think it's going to be a year where really the style of the wine will be defined by the winemaker and the moment that the winemaker chooses to pick in this wonderfully cool sort of long season that we're seeing develop right now. Now, the second part of today, we want to talk a little bit about criteria for harvest. And I've got 4 criteria for harvest. And number 1 is flavor. Now, any winemaker who tells you that they only pick on flavor is probably bullshitting you. I honestly believe that if you do not take Brix pH readings to help guide you in your decision on where to pick, that is pretty crazy because you wouldn't know your potential alcohol, you wouldn't know your acidity. Now, I mean, if you are sort of the old school winemaker, if you're Jim Clendenin, if you're Ken Brown, you know, if you're Rick Longoria, you probably have a pH meter in your mouth and you can probably taste that fruit and say, it's ready. And I believe you. But young winemakers and even winemakers sort of in their journeyman years, until you're a master, I really don't think it's very wise to just taste the fruit and know. Also, there's variation in the vineyard. You got to taste a lot of different clusters and a lot of different berries to figure it out. But the 4 criteria I said are flavor, number 1. Number 2 is Brix. Number 3 is pH. And number 4 is TA or titratable acidity. Now, Brix is basically the percentage of sugar by weight in the berry. 25% sugar is absolutely candy sweet, and most winemakers would agree that 25 Brix is full ripeness. Now, at 25 Brix here at Clopepi, normally we would see a pH level probably around in the area of 3.3 to 3.4, which is beautiful. Now, pH in final wine goes from about 3.0 in sparkling wine all the way up to about 4.0 in a nice soft Napa Cab. So you could say the pH range for every table wine pretty much on the earth is between 3.0, very structured, a lot of acidity, a lot of verb, to 4.0, very soft, melted, and mellow wine. So if the wine is soft, it's probably above 3.5. If the wine is structured, it's probably between 3.0 and 3.5. pH is actually the measure of hydrogen ion activity in solution, how fast those little hydrogen ions are swimming around. So, and then we also talk about TA, and TA is titratable acidity or the total acidity in the wine. Now, the best way it's been described to me is TA is like how many fish are in the fish in the aquarium. Now, if you have 12 fish, the fish weigh a certain amount. So the fish and the amount of fish and the weight of the fish in an aquarium would be like TA. And the pH is how fast those fish are swimming around. Now, interestingly, you can take a bit of juice and add some water to it, and the pH doesn't shift very much because you're just giving those hydrogen ions a little more room to run around. But if you add water to juice and measure the titratable acidity, you'll see the TA actually shift a lot because it's actually weighing how much acid is in the solution, and if you add water to it, you're adding more solution, so the weight is actually lessened. So pH is a little bit more about mouthfeel. How the wine impacts sort of the sides of your tongue and the acidity and the verve of the wine, and then the TA, of course, is set. So you actually, the TA would be a little bit more as far as, it's kind of a little bit difficult to describe, but TA is the actual weight of the acidity, pH is actually the hydrogen ion activity. So I usually say pH is more mouthfeel, TA is a set number that really doesn't change much. Flavor, obviously very important. We taste the juice, we make tasting notes on the juice, and we try to do everything we can to look at the flavors. When strawberry and blackberry begin emerging in the juice, we know it's going to make a certain style of wine. While it still has apple and kiwi, even in Pinot Noir, we know that that's going to make a certain style of wine. So flavor is very, very important. Flavor is sort of the last switch. The Brix for us is between 23 and 25. pH is between 3.25 and 3.4. Those are our go numbers, and then of course we taste the fruit, we taste the juice, we make notes on the juice, see how it's changing, look what's happening with the weather, and if the heat's coming, we're going to think about picking. If it's going to be nice and cool, we know we have a little bit more time. Right now we're going to have a little warm up today on Monday, and then a cool rest of the week, and maybe a little bit of warm up on the weekend. So we're ready to rock. We're already about 25% in on Pinot Noir. We haven't even started on Chardonnay. So maybe in the next few weeks we'll talk a little bit about how we taste Chardonnay and how Chardonnay is a little different than Pinot. But for now, I've got some wonderful ability to sit back and talk to you guys during harvest. We haven't had the busiest, craziest harvest yet, but I'm sure that's coming. So maybe next Monday you'll see a little more bags under my eyes and I'll look a little bit more weary. But for now, we're having a wonderful winemaker's vintage, and I hope now that I've defined that a little bit better for you. So have a great week. Drink more Pinot because we're making a lot up here, and we'll be ready to get you lots of 2013 Pinot, and we're expecting a fantastic vintage. Have a great week. Talk to you soon.